Right. Thank you for joining us. We are excited to talk about Black Smoke, African Americans and the United States of Barbecue with author Adrian Miller. If you have questions, please post them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the program. Adrian is a food writer, James Beard Award winner, attorney, and certified barbecue judge who lives in Denver, Colorado. Black Smoke is his third book. His previous titles are Soul Food, The Surprising Story of an American Cuisine, One Plate at a Time, and The President's Kitchen Cabinet, the story of African Americans who have fed our first families from the Washingtons to the Obamas. So welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm going to turn off my camera and let you do your presentation, and I'll come back at the end for questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to the Fort Worth Public Library for this opportunity to share about Black Smoke. So what I'm going to do this hour is I'm going to tell you about my journey, how I came to write this book, and then give you a sense of the major themes of the book, and then just go chapter by chapter and explain how it's kind of organized. And then I will be happy to take your questions because barbecue talks get really fun when we get to the question and answer period. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hold on just a moment. All right, so here is a picture of me at one of my favorite barbecue joints in Denver, Colorado. That's where I live and where I was born and raised. And I know as soon as I said that, I probably lost all street cred on the subject of barbecue, but let me win you back. My parents are from the American South. So my mom is from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and my dad is from Helena, Arkansas. So they met in Denver in the 1960s and stayed there. And essentially barbecue, Southern food, soul food, that was all part of my food traditions growing up. You are encouraged to do social media. My handle on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter is Soul Food Scholar. So put in the word Soul Food Scholars, you're going to find me. So please, if you have something positive to say, please do social media. If you have something negative to say, hold on to that. There's really no reason to share that, right? Just quickly, my writing journey. So again, I was born and raised in Denver, went to Stanford University undergrad, then went to Georgetown Law School, practiced law for a few years, and then worked also in the Clinton White House. And it was really after my stint in the Clinton White House that I started my writing career. And essentially, the seed for that was planted right after working for President Clinton when I went to a local bookstore and I found a book on the history of Southern food written by John Edgerton called Southern Food at Home, on the Road, in History. And in that book, he wrote that the tribute to African American achievement in cookery had yet to be written. So I thought that was really interesting. I reached out to Mr. Edgerton and asked him, if he thought that was still true, because I was reading the book about 14 years after he had written it. And he said, you know what? Some people have taken on parts of the story, but no one's taken on the full story. And there's always room for another voice. So that's really what launched me into writing about soul food. And originally in my soul food book, I was going to include a chapter on barbecue, but I found so much material on barbecue. I said, you know what? It probably needs its own treatment. That book won a James Beard Award, which is the highest honor you can get for food writing. And then based on my research on soul food, I came across the stories of African Americans who had cooked for our presidents. And that became my second book, The President's Kitchen Cabinet, which came out in 2017 and was nominated for a number of awards. But enough of my backstory. Okay, I just wanted to give you a drive-in feel. I don't know why, but I just like that. So the question is, why do you write this book? So as I mentioned earlier, I was writing this book on the history of soul food, and I figured I was going to do a chapter on barbecue, and I found so much material, I thought I would do my own book. So 2004, I'm watching the Food Network, and there was a show called Paula's Southern Barbecue, which essentially Paula Deen. And so I thought, well, even though I'm writing about soul food, here's a great opportunity to just find out who are the leading personalities in the current trends in Southern barbecue. So I watched this show, and an hour later, as the credits were rolling, my mouth was agape because not one African American was featured on that show. So I sat there saying to myself, okay, 2004, first of all, how does that even happen? And then the second thing I thought is, well, maybe I got it twisted. Maybe it was Paula Deen's Scandinavian barbecue, sponsored by Alabama white sauce, and I just got it twisted. So I started looking at other barbecue television shows, magazine articles, newspaper articles, and I noticed a disturbing trend. Typically in media that was covering barbecue, African Americans were either minor players in the story or left out entirely. And so that I felt was something that needed to be corrected because barbecue is a huge part of my food traditions and also that of other African Americans. So that led me to write this book. So here's how it started. For 200 years or so, barbecue was basically this: cooking a whole animal over a trench filled with hardwood burning coals. And so this is a Harper's Weekly magazine that was illustrated and had an article about an Atlanta exposition in 1895. The date of this is November 9th, 1895. And at the Atlanta exposition, they had a Georgia barbecue exhibit. And so this was a chance for people who attended that exposition to get real Georgia barbecue. So we're going to zoom in here and just spend a moment talking about this. So here you see the trench. You see the hardwood burning coals underneath. You see that they're whole animals that were cooked. Usually the carcass was butchered and then butterflied, and either poles were stuck through the side of the carcass so that it could be flipped periodically for even cooking, or sticks were laid across the trench and then the carcasses were put on the sticks. And somehow they figured out how to flip that and do even cooking. But you see two African-American men in the very center of this illustration, and that shows you how indispensable African-Americans were to barbecue. Then let's go counterclockwise. We're going to the right. We see another African-American man with a shovel. You can see that there are hardwood burning coals in the shovel. So typically there was a separate fire maintained, and it was someone's job to just monitor the trench, or what we call a pit, monitor the pit. And if there were cold spots, they would get some coals from that live fire and put them in the cold spots, again, to maintain even temperature of the pit. And then we've got a group of white people who are watching this, and they were spectators, and true to form, this was a spectacle. Barbecue was a huge production. A lot of people would gather on the periphery of a barbecue event just to watch all that was going on. Going further counterclockwise, we've got two African-American men sitting on a bale of hay. It's kind of hard to make out here, but essentially one of the gentlemen is practicing a musical instrument, harmonica. And the reason why this is significant is because African-Americans were often called upon to provide entertainment after a barbecue took place. And then at the top of the picture, we've got another African-American man who is cooking something called Brunswick stew. Brunswick stew is the descendant of a hunter's stew. So initially, Native Americans had a mixture of wild game and vegetables that they put into a stew. And later, chickens were added to the modern equivalent of it, the contemporary equivalent of that dish. So he's cooking the Brunswick stew, and this was a well-known accompaniment for Georgia barbecue. And then we've got, to complete the circle, we've got a white man in a top hat who's just kind of pointing at things and giving orders. And so by the time we get to the 1890s, we see that a lot of white men are being celebrated for their barbecue prowess, even though they're relying on Black labor. But this was what barbecue was. No matter where you went, whether you were in Kentucky, in Texas, Georgia, Virginia, it was cooking this way. It was only later that we start to get the variations that we so celebrate today. All right, so we get that. And now we fast forward to 2003. This is from Bon Appetit magazine, and it was a big story within the magazine about who's who in American barbecue. So let's zoom in here. All right. So do you remember the Where's Waldo cartoons of the 1990s? Now, the virtue of those cartoons is that Waldo was actually somewhere in the illustration. So I'm going to ask you, where are the African Americans? And, we'll just cut to the chase because, as you can see, there are no African Americans featured in this celebration of American barbecue. The closest thing we get to diversity is the Asian American man in the middle with the beach ball. And then if you go two people over to his left, we see a woman at a grill with another guy. But essentially, it's all white men, white dudes who are celebrated in barbecue. So the question is, how do we get from that Harper's Weekly illustration to this who's who in barbecue illustration in Bon Appetit magazine? And that's essentially the reason why I wrote this book. is that, hey, if you're going to talk about barbecue in the United States, you have to include African Americans, because African Americans were pivotal to barbecue for centuries, until recently. Media coverage and other things have moved away from an African American viewpoint on barbecue. So the way I begin the book is I talk about the Native American foundation of barbecue. And look, I wanted to clearly establish that African Americans had invented barbecue. I wanted to do that, cross my arms and say Wakanda forever, but the evidence led me to another conclusion. So the earliest description that we get of barbecue is of Christopher Columbus and his crew arriving in the Caribbean and seeing indigenous people cooking in a way they had never really hadn't seen before. And over on the left, it was similar to that scene. So they were cooking fish, iguanas, and other vegetables on a raised platform made out of sticks over a very slow fire. And the word barbecue comes from the Spanish word barbacoa, which was an approximation of what the indigenous people were calling the raised platform of sticks. So barbecue is this is like a game of historical telephone. You've got the indigenous word that gets translated into Spanish that then gets translated into English. So barbecue did not describe anything but the raised platform. It was only later that it was used to describe the food that was cooked and the cooking process. Another thing that we see this raised platform throughout the Americas, including the American South. So it wasn't just limited to the Caribbean. Another technique we see is the earth oven. And the earth oven is digging a vertical hole, and then at the bottom of that hole, having a mixture of wood and stones, and you'd set the wood on fire, and the stones were there to retain the heat. And then you would alternately layer green vegetation that had a high water content or moisture content, and then meat. And the idea is you create these layers until you got to the top, and then you would either cover it with something or even dirt. And then you would just let that meat steam in this process of cooking, sometimes all day or overnight. And then you would unbury it and have a delicious meal. Another way of cooking was something called piercing sticks, where essentially you killed an animal and you cut off some of the flesh, and you would affix the flesh to a stick that was planted in the ground, and you could either move it towards the fire or away to regulate the cooking. Or you could have a very long stick planted in the ground and put a morsel of meat on that stick, and it had to be kind of thin enough at the end of the stick so that the meat morsel bent it towards the fire, and that was another way of cooking. Another way was to create a rotating spit out of sticks, because Native Americans had not developed metallurgy by the time that Europeans arrived. Now, this would have been very familiar to Europeans because they cooked in a very similar way. And then the fifth way that I treat meat smoking tradition or cooking tradition that I identified is the shallow pit. And essentially, this is not as deep a hole as the earth oven, but essentially a depression in the ground. Again, a combination of wood and stones, and the meat would either be laid right on the wood and stones for cooking, or you would have sticks laid across and lay the meat on that. And I identified all of these smoking traditions from the diaries of European travelers, because of all the players in the early barbecue story, Native Americans, enslaved Africans, and Europeans. Only Europeans had a literary tradition. The other groups of people relied on oral traditions. And so, unless somebody chronicled those, we just don't have an idea of how things were cooked around the time of European contact. And my argument is that this shallow pit method was the precursor of what would eventually be called Virginia barbecue, and then ultimately Southern pit barbecue. So what we understand now is that by the time you get to the late 1700s, early 1800s, African Americans and barbecue are hitched together. And so blackness and barbecue are wedded. And this is an article that was printed in 1839 from a newspaper called the Bangor Whip. And the writer was trying to explain to people in Maine what a true Southern barbecue or Virginia barbecue was at the time. And so he reached out to a friend of his who was a native Virginian. And if we go to the third sentence in this newspaper article, it says, on the previous day, some favorite Negro man of reputation for skill and experience in the business is sent up with his assistants, who proceed to make a kiln or pit of stones. And so what this is telling you is that, hey, look, if you're going to have legit barbecue, you have to have an African American man cooking it. And this article is not an isolated example. There are articles like this all over the place in newspapers during the 19th century. So with that, we understand that enslaved African Americans and their descendants become barbecue's go-to cooks. And what happens after emancipation is that African Americans who were forced to do this cooking emerge with a very marketable and coveted skill. Now, the reason why Blackness and barbecue get wedded is because barbecue, at least on a very grand scale, could not happen without enslaved labor. So there's a reason why you don't hear about fried chicken dinners for 10,000 people at the turn of the 19th century, because that would have been a logistical nightmare. But you do hear about that with barbecue. We hear barbecues of 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 people. And that's possible as long as you have enough land, enough animals to kill, enough food and side dishes, and you had enough labor. And given the racial dynamics of our country, if you wanted a big job done and you didn't want to pay people, you made enslaved African Americans do it. So that's how African Americans get connected to this cuisine, because it's very labor intensive, at least old school barbecue, and African Americans did that cooking. So after establishing that foundation, then I have thematic chapters. And so I tried to delve in and investigate different aspects of African American barbecue culture. And in each chapter, I have recipes, and I also have biographical essays of people that I thought evoked the themes of that chapter. So the first chapter I explored is this idea of church barbecue. And we see that during slavery, enslaved African Americans would often build community through barbecue. And these barbecues took place on the weekends when the work schedule slowed, and also on special holidays. Because again, whole animal cooking demands community, right? They didn't have refrigeration or any other way to deal with leftovers. So whenever they barbecued, it was a large gathering. So it reinforced not only community and social ties, but familial ties as well. And early in the 19th century, there were really two community leaders that figured out that barbecue was a great way to build a crowd and get people to do something you wanted them to do. And those were politicians and preachers. So we see several examples of spiritual practice involving barbecue. So on the left-hand side, this is an ad from a newspaper in the 1920s out of Montana showing a barbecue. And I show you this on purpose because this guy is cooking a cow. And I wanted to emphasize that barbecue is not always pork. Those whole animals that I talked about that could wind up over the pit could be a cow. And if it was a cow, it was usually quartered. A whole pig, goat, lamb. You could see possum, squirrels, all kinds of animals could arrive over the pit. And on the right-hand side of your screen is a guy from Denver, Colorado named Daddy Bruce Randolph Sr. He was from Pastoria, Arkansas, and moved to Denver in the early 1960s and ended up running a barbecue restaurant. And the reason why I show him is he wasn't an ordained minister. And there are a lot of Black preachers who run barbecue businesses, or Black churches that have an affiliated barbecue business. But he was just a lay person, but a man of faith who really took his faith seriously. So after his barbecue restaurant got established and was going fairly well, he created a tradition of providing free meals on Thanksgiving. So by the time you get to the 1970s, he's feeding 10,000 people regularly during Thanksgiving. He died in 1994. But his legacy meant so much to the community that people continued to have the free meal program on Thanksgiving in his honor. Now, I have to tell you, studying barbecue has been distracting to my own spiritual life. I am a person of faith, and every time I read the Bible, whenever there's a reference to a burnt offering, my mind starts to wander. When I think about the story of Moses and the burning bush, I wonder, did it smell like hickory or oak, maybe mesquite? The Valley of Dry Bones, that prophecy, with the spare ribs. Okay, I'll stop blaspheming, but you get the point. And after I talk about church barbecue, then I talk about what I call barbecue freelancers. So these were the people who emerged from slavery, newly emancipated, and they could make barbecue on their own terms. And there was still a great appetite for Southern barbecue, not only in the South, but around the country. And so we have examples of African Americans being put on stagecoaches, boats, and trains and taken to the far parts of the nation in order to give an authentic taste of Southern barbecue, because it was believed that the only way you could get great barbecue was to have it cooked by an African American. So this is a guy named Columbus B. Hill, born in West Tennessee. He makes his way to Colorado in the 1870s, and by the time you get to the 1880s, he's doing barbecue regularly for large crowds. And on July 4th, 1890, when during the cornerstone laying ceremony for the Colorado State Capitol, he does a barbecue for 25,000 people. Now, I know you're thinking, okay, this guy has just mentioned 2 Colorado barbecue people. Is this what this book's about? No. I'm just telling you the examples that I found compelling for these chapters. And the reason why I celebrate Columbus Hill is during most of the 19th century, a lot of African-American barbecuers were not named fully. Sometimes they weren't named at all. They were completely anonymous, and no one ever talked to them. That wasn't the case with Columbus B. Hill. We actually have extensive interviews of him talking about his process. He doesn't give up all the secrets, but we know his name. We have a little bit of a background. So he seems like an interesting person to highlight. And then after that, I talked about, well, okay, you have these traveling kind of barbecue people, but what happens when they plant roots and want to open up a barbecue business? And so I talked about barbecue. I wrote about barbecue entrepreneurs. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you've got William Perry, Henry Perry, I'm sorry. William Perry was the refrigerator, played for the Chicago Bears, but I don't know why I even brought him up. But Henry Perry is the acknowledged godfather of Kansas City barbecue. And this is an ad from a newspaper that he put in the 1910s. And interestingly, he's from West Tennessee as well. Shows up in Kansas City around 1905 or so. He was originally a porter, but eventually he starts running a barbecue stand in an alley, and then he got a brick and mortar location. But he is the one who taught the Bryants, Arthur and Charlie Bryant, the Gates family, and all these other legendary Kansas City barbecue figures. He's the one who taught them how to cook. Also, on the right-hand side of your screen is Ernestine Vanderval, who's from Nicodemus, Kansas. And if you don't know about Nicodemus, Kansas, you should definitely read up on it. Nicodemus, Kansas was one of the earliest all-Black communities founded by newly freed African Americans who wanted to create an agricultural colony. And so it was a thriving town for a long time. Ernestine Vanderval grew up there, but like other people, she left to seek other opportunities, moved to Pasadena, California, where for years she ran a combination barbecue and soul food restaurant. Walt Disney loved her food, but later in life, she returned to Nicodemus and ran a barbecue restaurant there. Ernestine Vanderval has died, but her niece, Angela Bates, is carrying on the legacy. And so essentially you can get that barbecue on the weekends because Nicodemus is almost a ghost town now. There's very few people who live there, but the town is intact. And a lot of tourists go there on the weekends, so the barbecue stand runs then. But I also wanted to underscore the point that as much as barbecue is presented as dude food, African-American women have been in the barbecue game for a long time. This is an example of showing you that not all our entrepreneurs were welcome. This is an editorial headline from the Chicago Defender, which was a major Black newspaper at the time, warning people about getting barbecue from people selling it on the streets. They just felt it was too unsanitary. Then I spend quite a bit of time writing about the African-American barbecue aesthetic. What makes African-American barbecue distinctive from other types of barbecue? Is there an African-American spin? I believe there is. One thing is sauce. There's a conventional wisdom emerging that barbecue should be unsauced. I'm going to go out on a limb and say most African-Americans will say, says who? I mean, seriously, y'all, I've been to restaurants where my barbecue was served as an ocean of sauce with little islands of meat poking through. That's how important sauce was. Maybe that's overkill, but that's just how some people do it. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you've got Arthur Bryant, legendary barbecue man in Kansas City, who died in 1982. And the editorial cartoonist for the Kansas City Star drew this cartoon where Arthur Bryant is at the pearly gates with St. Peter, and St. Peter asks, "Did you bring the sauce?" On the right-hand side of the screen, you've got an ad from an Atlanta newspaper. And interestingly, you don't see a lot of commercial products that link Blackness to the barbecue product that they're trying to sell. I really thought there would be an Aunt Jemima or Uncle Faustus or Uncle Ben corollary for barbecue products because of the strong association with African Americans, but that really doesn't develop. This is the closest we come, but I like this image because rather than being condescending, it is showing this African American man as an expert. He's cooking the old way over a pit. You see the butterfly animals, and it just signifies that this guy knows what he's doing. For the chapter, I wrote about Argia B. Collins and mumbo sauce. Mumbo sauce is a very unique barbecue sauce out of Chicago, although a lot of people in Washington, D.C. will argue that they created mumbo sauce, and it's kind of an interesting rivalry. But I had to include this brother in my book because look at him. I mean, that is one sharp looking dude, right? I had to write about him and include that illustration. Then I talk about competition barbecue and give my thoughts as to why we don't see enough African Americans on the barbecue competition circuit. I believe it's because of money. It takes a lot to be on the competition circuit and thrive. And unless you have the resources and the kind of lifestyle that will allow you to do that, you're not going to see a lot of people who are working class on that circuit. The first winner of the Memphis in May competition, the largest barbecue competition in the world, is this woman, Bessie Caffey. And she showed up with a very minimal setup and won. So can you imagine that happening today? Somebody showing up with just like a simple grill, doing some ribs and taking the first prize? No, that's probably not going to happen. In this chapter, I wrote about Sylvie Curry. She's the most recognizable African-American woman and African-American on the competition circuit. And she calls herself the Lady of Q. And if you're a fan of Netflix, you will see there's a show called American Barbecue Showdown. She's on that show and she has a pretty good run. I'm not going to give away any spoilers, but I think you'll be very impressed by the barbecue that she serves. Let's quickly go through different African American influenced regional styles of barbecue. We got the Carolinas, and I know some people are going to be upset because I'm lumping South Carolina with North Carolina, but I don't have a lot of time to talk about these things. So essentially, this is the land of pork barbecue. So it's either going to be whole hog cooking or pork shoulders, usually a vinegar-based sauce. In some parts, is maybe ketchup or mustard, a lot of things going on. This is from one of my favorite places. It's called Grady's Barbecue in Dudley, North Carolina. So you've got a slaw there. You've got some chopped pork shoulder with a vinegar sauce and then some hush puppies. That's a typical side in North Carolina barbecue. And then you've got Deep South barbecue. So this is, parts of Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas. To me, it's going to be pork shoulder or pork spare ribs with Southern side dishes like collard greens, potato salad, Southern desserts. Memphis is barbecue's equivalent of Funky Town. So not only do you have pork shoulder, and this is a typical pork, or I should say an atypical pork sandwich, because this to me is the platonic form of pork sandwiches. This is from a place called Payne's Barbecue. And so the formula for a pork shoulder sandwich in Memphis is bread, white bread of some kind, the pork shoulder, and then you can have slaw added and then sauce and then more white bread. At Payne's, they have a mustard slaw, which is something you kind of see in a few places in Memphis, but just sublimely smoked pork. So if you ever get to Memphis, please stop by Payne's. But not only do they have pork sandwiches like this, we'll see some other interesting things that happen in Memphis. But Memphis is really known for spare ribs, right? You have the dry ribs invented by a guy named Charlie Virgos, a Greek immigrant, part of a Greek immigrant family who relied on black cooks. And essentially, it's just barbecued ribs that were charcoal broiled with Greek seasoning as it. And then you've got the wet ribs, which is just adding sauce. Chicago is a place that has its own distinctive style, doesn't get a lot of love. But in Chicago, you're going to have pork spare ribs, usually pork spare rib tips, chicken, hot link sausage, fries, all of that either drowned in sauce and even probably wrapped with some white bread. East Texas. Now, when people say Texas barbecue, they usually gravitate to the center of the state, places like Austin, Texas. But for those of you who are familiar with Texas's barbecue scene, there are multiple traditions. And so one that's really heavily influenced by African Americans is East Texas. The earliest writings that we have of barbecue that wasn't done by the indigenous people there comes from the 1820s and 30s, where we have descriptions in newspapers and magazines of African Americans doing the pit barbecue that was common in other parts of the South. But in East Texas, I would say the form of the barbecue is different, even though you do have pork and beef and chicken and other things, but it tends to be chopped up, kind of messier than what you see in other parts of the state, sauce. And in East Texas, there's a pronounced kind of Creole influence. So you might see dirty rice, for example, as a side dish. Kansas City is an eclectic mix, and it kind of belies its roots as an agricultural town. And so in Kansas City, you're going to have pork, chicken, beef, ham, mutton, all kinds of stuff can show up on the plate in Kansas City with fries. Regardless of where you go in the country, you're typically going to see these things in a black run barbecue restaurant: pork spare ribs, some kind of chopped pork, chicken, or hot links. And the hot links can be made out of pork or beef, but some kind of sausage, very, very spicy sausage. That's what you're going to see often in black run barbecue joints. Let's talk about a few specialties. So rib tips. Rib tips used to be something you only saw in black restaurants. And really the origin story is that it started in Chicago. So the guy's named Leon Finney, who noticed that the stockyards were throwing away the rib tips whenever they started making St. Louis cut ribs. And, you know, ribs are ovular in shape. And so the St. Louis cut is an attempt to make a rack of ribs look more rectangular and uniform in appearance. So they're trimming off a lot of stuff. So the story goes is that Finney saw this happening. He waited for the stockyards to close. Then he would do some dumpster diving, take all of that meat, wash it off, and cook it up and sell it. And of course, when the stockyards noticed what was happening, they started charging for it. Monroe County pork steaks. This is more kind of Kentucky, Southern Illinois, maybe parts of Missouri. This is essentially freezing a pork shoulder, cutting it into thick slices when somebody orders it, and then putting it on the grill, getting some char, and adding some sauce along with the sides and white bread. Barbecue bologna. If you've never had barbecue bologna, imagine taking a tube, we're not talking about the slices now that you came home and put in the skillet and watched it puffed up. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about a tube of bologna. And what you do is you put slits in the tube, put it on the smoker for several hours. And then when it comes off the smoker, when somebody orders it, you're just going to cut a thick slice of it, put it on the grill to get some char. And then it's the same formula as the pork sandwich. So white bread, the bologna, if you want slaw and sauce, and then more white bread. It's delicious. And then Memphis also has something called barbecue bologna. If you've never had barbecue bologna, imagine this. Instead of marinara sauce, you use barbecue sauce and you mix it in with the noodles and then a seasoned meat mixture, primarily of barbecued meat. It is glorious. I'm just telling you. I know some of you, I can just tell some of you are skeptical. It's glorious. Another specialty is burnt ends. So despite what you hear, burnt ends are not from Texas. I'm sorry, my Texas friends, but burnt ends were created in Kansas City by this man, Arthur Bryant, who I've mentioned earlier. And this is the fatty ends of brisket, a lot of gristle, maybe just a little bit of meat. And a lot of barbecue people would cut that off and throw it away because they just didn't think customers would want that. And so Arthur Bryant's stroke of genius was to save those that stuff that was going to get thrown away and chop it up. And he put it in a bowl, and then he would serve it to customers as a free thing to munch on while their order was being processed. So burnt ends come from Kansas City. And the burnt ends that I show here, this is from the Jones sisters in Kansas City. This, from what Kansas City people tell me, I think they're called Kansas Cityans. What they tell me is that this is really more like what burnt ends were like in the beginning. Most of us think of burnt end as these perfectly manicured cubes of brisket. And those aren't burnt ends. What you're getting is brisket. Burnt ends are so popular now that a lot of restaurants are faking the funk by, instead of just sticking to that limited real estate of that fatty, gristly part, they're now cutting up brisket and calling it burnt ends. And I argue in the book that barbecue media has fallen deeply, madly, softly, however you want to describe it, in love with white dudes who barbecue. And there are really four kinds of white dudes who barbecue. You've got moving from left to right, you've got the competition guy. So Tuffy Stone is a great example of that. World champion multiple times, very accomplished on the barbecue circuit. You've got the Bubba type, like the working class white guy. So Myron Mixon is a great example of that. Now he's a hybrid because he's not only dude from the rural South, but he's also a very accomplished competition guy. Then you've got Aaron Franklin of Franklin Barbecue in Austin. He represents the urban hipster type, right? Very interesting, cerebral, creative, has glasses, interesting facial hair, maybe tattoos and piercings. You never know, but the urban hipster type. And then you've got people like Bobby Flay, who are the fine dining chefs who are now in barbecue in ways they never were before. I call them the tokes who smoke. And so why do these four men get celebrated over so many African Americans who could get some love with barbecue? And I argue it's because of people like me who are foodies. And so foodies are a group of people who emerge in the early 1990s. They are very curious about food, very interested in food, have more diverse palates than their parents' generation, and they're looking for authentic experiences. So barbecue was getting popular around the same time, and foodies were asking two questions: what's barbecue, and where do I get the good stuff? And the media that was emerging to cater to these groups of foodies weren't very interested in diversity. So instead of spreading the wealth and pointing out so many different types of barbecue experiences, they tended to gravitate to white guys. And so white men were often presented as barbecue's experts. And the foodies didn't know any better because they were new to barbecue. But anybody in the South would be like, what's up with that? Of course, African Americans should be celebrated in barbecue, but that's not what was happening on the national scene. So with the attention paid to white men in barbecue, there was a shifting away from an African-American barbecue aesthetic. So let's talk about kind of the major themes if you were to ask someone about what barbecue is today. Most people would say, oh, it's cooking low and slow, which means at a low temperature for a long period of time. Although early barbecue was cooked right over the heat source, right? When you're cooking low temperature, usually it's indirect cooking, more like smoking. But we, earlier from this presentation, that barbecue was cooked directly over the heat source. It's using lesser cuts of meat. Again, barbecue started out as cooking, as whole animal cooking, and borrowing from Robert Moss, who's the barbecue editor of Southern Living magazine. He points out that it really is until barbecue moves from a rural context to an urban context that there was a shift from whole animal cooking to cooking lesser cuts of meat. So spare ribs, brisket, parts of chicken, sausages. And when that shift happens, we get a flourishing and an innovation of barbecue regional styles. So the things that we fight about that we think are from time immemorial, they're only about 100 years old. Also minimal seasoning, that you should taste the meat, right? And so barbecue should only be prepared with just salt and pepper. That's a fine dining chef sensibility applied to barbecue, because most people will apply a rub and do other things to flavor their meat. And then, of course, I talked about my pet peeve, this idea that barbecue should not have any sauce. And again, the idea is that you should taste the meat but sauce hides it or whatever. But from the earliest days of barbecue, it always had sauce. Now, the sauce that was used, the mother sauce, was vinegar with red pepper, maybe some salt, and maybe some other spices. But essentially, that's the early sauce. And it was applied to meat during the cooking process to make sure that the meat was moist and flavored. So it was not a condiment. And it was only later that we get ketchup added in the 1870s. And then we're on the road to the very thick sauces that we have today. So I end my book by talking about barbecue's future. I talk about Rodney Scott, who's from Charleston, South Carolina. He's from Hemingway, South Carolina. Grew up in a family barbecue business. He's out on his own, and he started his first restaurant in Charleston. He now has places in Birmingham, Alabama, and Atlanta. He has come out with a cookbook, Rodney Scott's World of Barbecue. It's a fantastic book. And just to give you a sad footnote, his book is the first book by an African-American barbecue professional in 30 years. So think about all the barbecue books that come out written by white dudes every year. And it's only now that an African-American got that opportunity. That's crazy. Also talk about the Mitchell team, father and son team. So we've got Ed Mitchell, a legendary North Carolina barbecue figure, and his son Ryan are doing whole hog barbecue as well. They were poised to open a restaurant right before the COVID lockdown. So they had to wait and then pivot, but hopefully their restaurant will be open soon. But they're also doing whole hog barbecue. I talk about Deborah and Mary Jones out of Jones Barbecue in Kansas City. I showed you a picture of their burnt ends. If you watch Netflix, they were on Queer Eye in 2019, and their business blew up after that appearance. I mean, they're such great people, and they're doing really, really well. So I'm happy, very happy for them. The other thing that's just genius is they created a barbecue vending machine. So now 24/7, you can get your barbecue on. You can get a sandwich, a meal, or just barbecue sauce. I just think that's brilliant. And then I talk about barbecue's future. So we have some trends. One of the things you're seeing in African-American barbecue is turkey is taking the place of pork. So chopped, pulled, chopped in the Carolinas, pulled in Memphis, turkey, hot links and ribs and tips in parts of the Midwest. So you're probably saying ribs. Well, here's a turkey rib. And I got this from the Gobble Stop Smokehouse in St. Louis. So essentially for a turkey rib, what they do is they take the shoulder blade of a turkey and they butcher it in a way that there's enough meat around the bone that it kind of looks like a baby back rib. And then they'll smoke that up. So you're starting to see this in a lot of places right now. And then some other things to think about. You're seeing a lot of plant-based barbecue now in African-American barbecue circles. And the most common plant used is jackfruit, which is from South Asia. And if you haven't had jackfruit, for somebody who knows what they're doing, now this is going to sound incredible, but for someone who knows what they're doing, you can make it look, taste, and have the texture of pork. And it's pretty remarkable. So it's very tasty. And it's kind of got a neutral taste, and I think that's why it works well. Holds up to smoking and other barbecue applications. And then some other stuff to think about because the technology is here. We do have the capability to grow meat in a lab. And the meat has the taste and texture of meat you'd find in other places. And we can also 3D print meat. So I don't know if American consumers will embrace this form of meat, but if they do, and that comes into barbecue circles, that will have tremendous implications for sustainability and animal welfare. The one thing they can't replicate right now is bones, but they can replicate the flesh. So will brothers and sisters be grubbing on this or Impossible ribs in 10 years? I don't know, but I wanted to explore that possibility. So I ended my book in a way that I didn't expect. I thought I was going to write a doom and gloom scenario. We got to do all we can to save African-American barbecue, but I'm actually really excited. There certainly are fewer brick and mortar locations than there were, say, 50 years ago that are African-American owned, but the barbecue scene has just shifted. We've got more people doing mobile food trucks. We've got people doing pop-ups. We've got the brother and sister still on the side of the road or in the parking lot doing their thing. And of course, church barbecue and other expressions of African-American barbecue continue to thrive. So Black Smoke was published last April. It's available at your library, independent booksellers, online booksellers. And then also we have the audiobook was just released. So there's so many ways that you can get Black Smoke. And I hope you take the time to read it. Thank you again for listening to my presentation. And I look forward to answering your questions.
All right. So I already had some questions, but now I have some other questions. So I want to talk about the jackfruit first, because I read that in the book and I was really interested in, I think you talk about a situation where I think it's in Denver that there was a bunch of vegans and they were eating jackfruit and then they were sending it back because they thought it was actually meat. Can you kind of talk about that some?
Yeah, so it happened in Boulder, Colorado. So I was at a business meeting and I was on my way back to Denver and I saw this barbecue joint in an unexpected place. So I was like, oh, let me just check it out. And so I was going to order something else and I saw jackfruit and I said, jackfruit, what's that? And the owner, in order to convince me to get it, told me that story. He said, well, let me, he's like, I know you're skeptical, but let me just tell you the story. And he said, yeah, there was a vegan convention up the street because it was down the street from the convention hall in Boulder. And he said there was a vegan convention up the street. They stopped by. And, they saw that on the menu and, first of all, I'm like, why are vegans going to a barbecue joint? But, anyway. And so they ordered it and he said they started sending it back. And that's what convinced me to try it. And I got to tell you, I was really impressed. I was just like expecting it to be trash. And I thought it was really good.
I just think that's really funny. Let's talk about sauce. So, and you talk about it quite a bit in the book, how important it is, the differences and the secrecy, and why you shouldn't ask somebody what's in your sauce.
Yes. So, again, there's this conventional wisdom, and this really didn't emerge until we had this pivot away from African-American aesthetic of barbecue. But this conventional wisdom, barbecue should not be sauced. And, I just don't know why people think that. I mean, you can have, if you like your barbecue unsauced, that's fine, but I don't think there should be this official pronouncement that that's the only true barbecue. Now, I am sympathetic to the idea that barbecue sauce can hide mistakes. And I know some people do that. But to me, it's just like a chef. When you go to a fine dining restaurant, the chef usually has a sauce to round out the dish. And I don't know why we don't have that grace for barbecue. And so I talk about, for a lot of barbecue entrepreneurs, sauce is the calling card. I would just strike up conversations with people I don't even know. And I would just say, hey, which one, what do you think is more important with barbecue, the meat or the sauce? African Americans, I mean, by a wide margin, would say the sauce. And I even had somebody say, well, look, anybody can cook the meat. It's all about the sauce. Now, I don't agree with that because I know there's a lot of people who cannot cook the meat. But, and there's always a pursuit of the sauce. And so there's so many stories of people being given a sauce recipe and told not to share it until they're about to die. And as I quoted one person in my book, he's like, well, how do I know that? So, so no, the sauce is a very important of African American barbecue culture.
And so you talked about that originally it was mostly just vinegar and spices, but now it's more ketchup based. Are there other bases for sauce?
Well, in parts of the country, you do have a mustard barbecue sauce. So in the Carolinas and northern Florida, I've seen some mustard barbecue sauce. And I got to tell you, I'm a big fan. I just think the mustard sauces are really tasty. So those are primarily the ones that I've seen. It's either usually a vinegar base or tomato base in terms of the proportions, right? Because there are a lot of hybrid sauces. You got a lot of sauces that are almost equal vinegar and tomato based. But yeah, these mustard sauces, I like the tanginess. I'm a big fan, and I was skeptical of those too.
That sounds really good. I'm not a huge tomato eater, so I like tomatoes, but I don't like ketchup, and I'm kind of one of those weird people. So mustard, mustard sounds really interesting.
You might dig those.
And if you have any questions in the audience, you can certainly put them in the chat and we'll ask them. I want to talk a little bit about the research process. So obviously a good portion of the time you're looking for records, particularly records about African Americans. They're slim, they're hard to find. If you can find them, they're microfiche. Can you talk about kind of your research process and how you gathered all your information?
Yeah, so the biggest boon to my research were newspapers and magazines. There are more and more companies, and the Library of Congress are digitizing a lot of these old sources, and they're word searchable. So, it's time consuming because there's a lot of newspapers out there. And so you have to sit there and figure out how was this food discussed in that time, spellings, all that kind of stuff. But anyway, found a lot of stuff through that. And that's why I love newspapers, because newspapers were about capturing the life of their community. And so you found a lot more vivid descriptions of barbecue and barbecue people and the culture in newspapers and magazines than you ever would find in a book. A lot of it was just talking to people and getting those kind of stories that don't show up anywhere. And then because I care about my research so much, I decided to eat my way through the country. So I was going to like 200 barbecue joints, and, I only scratched the surface because there's so many different barbecue joints. And, when I would go to a city to eat, I have a pretty good social media following. So I just ask people, hey, where should I eat? And I often got a lot of recommendations there. I'd reach out to the local newspaper, restaurant people and magazines and just say, hey, I'm doing this. Where should I eat? And then I always tried to leave a couple of some extra time in a place so I could catch the places that don't show up on websites. There's a lot of places like that. And unfortunately, a lot of Black-owned places are like that. And I say unfortunately because today most consumers are finding places through the internet. And if you don't have a strong either social media or web presence, I think you're missing out on a lot of business. Local resident in the Dallas area, Daniel Vaughn, who writes for Texas Monthly, he's a great friend of mine, and he gave me a guided tour of some barbecue joints. And I know there's another group that does a Black barbecue tour of Dallas. And I don't know if they go to Fort Worth or not. So those are ways that I find out the great spots and do my research.
I'm Googling that right now. Okay. So you had said that if you had gotten to do this in person, there were some places that you would like to eat. So what are those?
So the one that comes to mind the most is Smokeaholics. I wrote about Smokeaholics. It's in Fort Worth. I wrote about that place for Garden and Gun, and I just didn't make it to Fort Worth the last time I was in that area. I pretty much focused in Dallas. I was focused in Dallas, and then went on to Austin and then Houston. So I need to pay attention to Fort Worth and check that out. But that's the place that I think of, Smokeaholics.
We actually have here in downtown. I don't know how good the barbecue actually is, because I haven't worked downtown very much, but we have a place called Bailey's Barbecue in downtown that is like this. It's in the middle of all the like the high rises, right? So they're grandfathered in that they get to keep their store. It's this little tiny store, and it's down by City Hall. And every time you walk past, it is just like the smell is so amazing. And for years and years, they were a cash only business. And interestingly, somebody told me that sometime during the pandemic, they switched over to taking credit.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Which was part of the reason why we went to when we were downtown, we wouldn't eat there because I never carry cash. So yeah. But is there anywhere else in kind of the area that you want to check out?
No, I can't think of any other place right now. I mean, those are two great spots, but yeah, Smokeaholics is the one that comes to mind the most.
And I put that link in the chat. And I thought it was interesting that one of the pictures you showed was barbecue spaghetti.
Yeah.
Yeah. And where is that?
So the picture that I showed you was from a place called the Barbecue Shop in Memphis. The barbecue spaghetti I've only seen in Memphis. That's why I think Memphis is barbecue's equivalent of Funky Town, because you got all kinds of weird. They even have barbecue pizza. That was something that Elvis loved. I think the place is called Colette's, but he used to order out for barbecue pizza and have it delivered. So, yeah, all kinds of interesting stuff happening there.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you mentioned that there was interesting. What other kind of interesting things do they have in Memphis?
Oh, I spoke about them. So, you've got the barbecue spaghetti, you've got the barbecue bologna, you've got the dry ribs. There's another thing. There's a place called Cozy Corner Restaurant that has Cornish hens. That's not something you see in a lot of places. It's very, very, very tasty. So,
all right. So, last question. Are you working on anything new?
yeah. So I got three things that I'm floating in my head right now. So one is a book on the history of African Americans, Black African Americans in Colorado, because we have a very rich history and a lot of people don't know it. I've been thinking about a history of African American street vendors. I have the music, sheet music, and lyrics for their street cries. So I can. So I'm thinking that book might have an audio component so people can hear these cries. And then the other thing is I've been thinking about a dining guide for difficult conversations. So how to have a series of dinner parties to address something difficult. It could be race. It could be any gender issues, anything that's facing a community, and how to do that through food. So those are the things I'm thinking of right now. I guess I should settle on one and get to work.
Well, all of those sound very interesting. So I would definitely be interested in reading all of those. Well, I want to thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. And if you would like to purchase a copy of the book, we have them. We are working with the Dock Bookshop. They're a local independent here in Fort Worth, and they have copies available to purchase. Thank you for your time. Thanks for joining us this evening, and have a great evening.